Hello, folks. Welcome to the Inevitability Curve. I am your host, Chris Blask. And in this series, we talk to interesting folks about where we have been, where we are, and maybe, some idea of where we're going on various topics. So with me today is the great Win Schwarta. Win, how are you doing?
I don't like that introduction, Chris, but
Everything's got some irony in it. It's okay, right? We know each other. It's well, and what I mean, right? The reason we're talking here today is because you've had an interesting life. You've done interesting things, right? And we can talk cybersecurity and so forth, but we're not really going to do that today.
Okay.
Right. This is MetaWar. Your new book, your focus. You and I and various friends have been talking about this for the last couple of years. We all know it. The information warfare, disinformation, misinformation, influence campaigns. We're at a certain spot with that today. And you've been thinking about that a lot. And everything about where you've been in your life and the things you've thought about. And before that, we can go back to single cell, life and how it responded to messaging and communications if we'd like. But, and when I say the great, I mean it, to a certain extent. You're a great guy. You wouldn't be one of my good friends if you weren't. But it's, we're all in the middle of this, right?
Yeah.
It's let me see what I can. We have the internet now, and everybody can see this, and they can talk to each other, and they can comment on it. Everybody on Earth, basically, right? That's new, and we've been here long enough to get some of the emergent properties that get us into nation-state disinformation campaigns and all those wonderful things that are worth spending time on. That's what I'd like to dig into with you today.
Okay.
So, any initial thoughts before we get into the before, during, and after?
Yeah, I'm just gonna say it. When I got involved with this project, when I came up with the stupid ass idea to start looking, I guess it was 8 years ago, into how neuroscience and security awareness was where it all began, just kind of behavioral thing. And then I met a roller coaster designer and some stuff going on in England. I thought I was looking at a purely technical issue. Okay, here comes the metaverse, yada yada. Where are we going to plug on the SIMs and the IDSs, and how's that all going to work? And kind of just going to prognosticate based upon some of the technologies that are being proposed. And then, I guess more than halfway through it, I left out the human being. Oh shit. Time to start all over again. And that I gave 11 talks in 5 days in Europe, and they beat the crap out of me, righteously so. I'm not bitching. These are my, I in fact dedicate a piece of the book to my Dutch friends for putting me back on the straight and narrow. It's from a cybersecurity standpoint, from everything I've ever done in my whole life, it sort of has come to a lot of holy shit moments. And with regards to the nation state issue you brought up, when I went into depression at one point in the book. It was towards the end when I was writing it, and I hit depression when I realized that the United States is fundamentally defenseless against any form of cognitive warfare. A cognitive Pearl Harbor may have already hit us, may not, and that gets into political discussions, which we're not going to do here. But when you look at MetaWar being the art and science of manipulating reality, well, all of that turned into, we have seen in the U.S., a systematic dismantling of all private and public research and efforts into cognitive security. And that, when I realized that, it scared the living hell out of me.
Well, and this is, I think we can bend that to a positive conversation, right? And this has always been my point about inevitability curves, right? In quite a number of things, where I started with all this, the internet itself, it's like inevitably we're going to get to the point we're at now. And if we are, then 30 years ago or 20, certain things are worth considering. A slightly more limited version of that is to say that there are possible futures, where we have in fact figured this out. I don't believe we're 100% guaranteed to never work any of this stuff out, which means that while we may not reach there are futures where we can stand and look back and say, aha, that's how we did it, right? And I think if we look all the way back, let me go roll that first banner for kicks. And as I said in the intro, we could, if you like, start with single cell life, because I think there's lessons in there that we can use today, or understandings, because just how you create messaging and respond to messaging and the survival characteristics, benefits of that, up to what we're doing today. But we don't have to. If you said in your intro, in our lifetimes, this has actually evolved a great deal. We could look at human history, recent human history, the last couple of centuries, the last couple of millennia, and see these patterns of evolving. So when we look back at where we've been, we have a couple starting spots we can choose. But again, the shape of this curve, I think, goes literally all the way back. So where do you want to start?
Well, the curve, when you say curve, I kind of look at it almost as a hysteresis curve, that we everything up through, and I'm going to pick a couple dates. Some people say Gutenberg. Okay, you want to play that game? Cool. Some people say the telephone. That's cool. And then Neumann and those eras, and okay, that's cool. I still, based upon what I've learned, or I think I've learned, and which I would love to argue about, is that when the IT really hit the fan for us, the curve, that steep part of the hysteresis, or hockey stick for some you marketing folks, really began in, I'm going to say 1956. And I picked that date only because that was IBM's first hard drive. And it's a date. You want to say the what, 4004 by Intel? Cool. But it's about the information glut. It's about TMI. Everything we're seeing today is about one fundamental thing. Are we, as human beings, able to coexist with technology? And that ended up being the existential question that I examined and came up with some ideas on. They don't have to be right, but there does need to be a discussion if our existential survival is of importance to anybody.
Well, and I always try to be clear when I'm thinking through future trends like this, that I could be wrong, and B, the answer may be something I don't like. Maybe open democracy and freedom of speech and so forth is not sustainable over the long term, and only authoritarian, dictatorship basically will be the human norm for millions of years, like forever. I don't think that's true. I tend to think that there are, among the possible futures, there are ways to figure out all these things as we keep doing. But maybe I'm wrong. And this case is, you see all the I like using Hammurabi, in supply chain. I think there's a lot of this in my cybersecurity day job. Supply chain is the thing.
Yeah.
And I like to harken back to all these points in history where we've done similar things and we worked it out. But in this case, maybe we don't. Maybe we can't handle the TMI and the AI and all the other acronyms that are coming at us.
Well, the biggest difference in, people say, well, it's happened before. All right. We'll say again, Gutenberg, the telephone, radio, and TV. Every one of those was a passive form of communication to the listener, recipient, user, whatever term, to us. That is entirely different than having active participation with a complex set of OODA loops, where you as a human being and your behavior and reaction to content becomes integral to the next bit of content that comes your way. Now you are part of the system. Is that symbiotic? Is it parasitic? And this is a lot of what I've explored technically, in that we are not tuned to deal natively at coming out the chute as babies. We are not tuned to survive with technology. We're tuned to survive with lions and bears and tigers, oh my, maybe. But that's really about it. Tech is not part of the human innate survival mechanism, and we're going to have to learn how to coexist a lot better if one of the inevitable curves and the probabilities comes out that we do make it.
I in 1998, I got in a head-on collision. Guy ran a red light at 70 miles an hour. Banging it pretty bad. And in physiotherapy, a number of months later, I was saying to the therapist, I get this. If I hold a cell phone to my head to this day, for more than a couple of seconds, my arm just starts going numb. A little nerve thing, right? And one of the little thing. And he said, you're really designed to survive falling out of a short tree and then limping for the rest of your life. So at a certain point, you got to say, I got hit with the energy of a Sidewinder missile, and I'm sitting here today, and yeah. So we're really not built for this, right? And I do, I have my concerns, right? We have so many of the things that excite me, like AI right now. I'm obsessed with the idea that every human being in the developed world, at least, will have a dedicated personal assistant in the foreseeable future. And I think that's in your 3, 5, 7 year sort of, near-term future at some point. And what does that even mean? Because as you said a second ago, to be clear, this has never happened before, ever. All of human history. What does it even mean if every single one of us has somebody who's always paying attention, knows, and just does the things that if you're an actual big business executive and you have an assistant that has so many benefits, we don't really know what that means. That much effectiveness and productivity. At the same time, in a less positive direction, we're not really built for this. Mm-mm. Maybe we can't figure it out, but these, if there is a success, I think it lies down the resonant path of history. It's history does not repeat, but it does rhyme. I think there's lessons.
It is amplifying. It's an amplified effect. The effect was the same, but it's so much further into the noise level way back when. First simple of writing, whether you're going to go with Rongo, or you're going to go with cuneiform. There was some form of writing that was attempting to communicate, and again, it was passive. So it's all down there in that noise level until, and again, my hockey stick, I pick a date. We can argue anytime over, but does it matter? Same thing when we were all doing InfoWar. Everybody goes, well, we need a definition. No, you don't. That puts you into the box. And once you're in the box, you see nothing else. And you're to the fundamental problem is all I see is all there is. And that is one of the most limiting mindsets you can have. So it's a curve. Everything is a curve. As you know, I've been ranting for how many decades now. And I don't know. There are answers. Are they going to work? It's going to take a huge interdisciplinary effort and somebody at national levels to actually give a shit.
Well, let's take that to the present, right? So this is where we are right now. And as we both said more than once in this conversation already, we're OODA folks: observe, orient, decide, act. The world is what it is. Mm-hmm. You're in it at a certain place. You just are, which means you have a couple of choices. Odds are you should pick one and just try that and then go back to the top, right? So we're here right now. And I want to riff for a second on something you touched on. I think the U.S. as a nation state is relatively unprotected. We don't have any nation state defenses against this. Things like fact checkers and so forth. I think we exercise some components, but we don't have a plan and we're not organized. And that's not the case everywhere in the world today. It was 5 years ago. It's not today. In Europe, as a good example, there are folks among our friends and colleagues working with serious official nation state EU organizations to put together the systematic sort of defenses that as information security people, you and I expect. So we're there today, right? And what else? What other current state, like where we are right now? What are your pros and cons, worries, hopes today?
The comparison to the EU and UK, it's a shame we have to say those two. For a few years, we could just say EU. Now we got to do both. They are so far ahead of us in this. And I don't mean necessarily technically. Yeah, they're doing stuff. They're spending roughly public private investment, and the public side is about 5 billion euros a year into cognitive security. Any, we can talk whether it's misinformation, any of those things, somewhere in that space, because they're trying to understand it and they're trying to understand coexistence. We dismantled it. Certain political forces in the United States dismantled every one of our efforts. And over the last years, I mean, I've spent how much time over in the EU because there are people I can talk to. There are people that are engaged. There are people that speak the language that are not afraid to. And over here, it has been stifled, extraordinarily stifled. So we've got to get out of that mindset of the me versus we. We have to become part of the we issue because the EU understands that far more than we do in terms of its collective mindset, its individual mindset. It's a cultural grasp on some sense of reality. They get it a hell of a lot more than we do. And I'm not going to go down any of those other roads because those are
let me see if I can find a pro on both sides of the pond on this one, right? Because you're right. I see in the EU, folks in the kind of boring, pedantic, organized efforts, that we all, we each know from our lives and careers, it really requires to make these really large scale things work. It's all well and good to say we should do a thing, but if you want, for example, a global internet, it requires thousands of hours of working group meetings and standards and everything else and committees and bureaucracy and so forth. It just doesn't work. Oh God, right?
Do that. I don't.
So shoot me, right? But again, it's one of these pros and cons because I want a global internet and everything else, and therefore I have to put up with committees because I can't build it myself, right? It won't work. It won't, So anyways, so my point being that we are actually going through this now in Europe, and as a Yank who's traveled the world like you have, I'm right now. I'm snowbirding in Canada, so I'm in Canada at the moment. Love Canada to death. But it helps me look at my own country. What is it America is actually good at? And I would argue that the same things that drive you and me a little mental right now is a benefit, right? That what we do as America is, if a lot of us think something and maybe it's stupid, we'll tend to run it up the flagpole anyways, and run around and kick it, knock it over, and set it on fire and see what it does. Yep. And our history shows, that actually tends to work really well. And as a, free speech, open source, capitalist, I have a libertarian streak that's a lot broader than you would think, based on my various, public political stances. But I get it. I'm not a MAGA guy, but I have lots of friends and family that way, and some of them I love more than people who agree with me more, and I get it, right? So I see the mechanisms, and I understand why there's the pushback on censorship and all these things that can be perceived. If I have a fringe position, maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong, but I would like to make sure I can say it. So I would argue that right now we have this dynamic tension because, I don't know anybody on the domestic political spectrum who isn't sick and tired of this, right? It's not just because you're a liberal, a West Coast elitist, techno, whatever, or not you personally, but anyway, anyways, humans, this is the inevitability curve thing, right? None of us want to be uncomfortable in an odd, weird, and dangerous space for a long time. We'll tend back towards normalcy. I think what we have today is the right dynamic tension domestically, internationally. We just realize that it's not funny anymore. We have to be able to run the lights. We can't keep the power systems running if at a certain point, which is now, I can make a deep fake audio that sounds exactly like the boss of the person who has the switch in the power station and just, call them, play that audio and say, oh, the town's on fire, turn the power off. You actually need to systematically engineer the solutions that will keep everything running in a world where deep fakes and, concerted information influence campaigns are a thing.
Mm-hmm.
I see the bones of that laying around, and you in your book and all the conversations you've been driving. That's where we are today. So, hopeful or not today, before we get into tomorrow?
Um, there's always an if. If it's going to take in the United States, as it has in Europe, national agreement to do something, an open mindedness to do something, to recognize the issue without fear. And right now, there is so much fear in this country. Um, I have to assume, and I'm saying this without specific knowledge, that an awful lot of the efforts to shut down open research, publicly funded research, and private research from the university level to the corporate level as well, and the pressures that have been put onto these organizations, um, that's got to go away if we're going to do anything, if we're going to solve anything. If we're going to remain inside of an isolationist echo chamber bubble, isolated from the rest of the world, when it comes to cognitive security, we're going to lose.
And that couldn't be a possibly better bridge to the next point, right? Because I think the evolutionary pressures, socioeconomic evolutionary pressures is really what you're talking about there, are what they are. And again, I may be wrong about this one, but this is, I can't be more clear on this. This is a point of mine. Free speech, open source, democracy, voting, capitalism. I believe in these things structurally. We need to implement various, definitions, but I think that's just, I think the time and effort wasted at a personal, at a corporate, at a national level on not being transparent, not being appropriately honest, right? And again, as folks like you and I have learned in our cybersecurity careers, there are answers to these things. We can share threat intelligence. Over the last 10, 20 years, we learned that, and know the initial response from the corporate world of, does this mean we're just telling everybody our weaknesses? Does this mean we're giving away all our intellectual property? And the answer is no. That would be, I don't know, dumb. Maybe what we'll do is make sure that the people that you already have a business relationship, that you've actually literally signed contracts and user license agreements and so forth, that they, under these circumstances, get access to that information in these times. We can engineer ways to deal with it, right? And when we do, every time we find a way to be more transparent, I think, and everywhere in the world, I think this is a human thing. But again, I think this is something that America, deserves credit for. We should feel good about this, because our history shows that, like it or not, whatever we're arguing about at the time, we just pragmatically find out that just being more honest, more transparent, faster, reduce the TMI just by telling the truth works. So I think that leans into fixing this.
In today's world, absolutely correct. And in older worlds, you could almost make the same argument. And I use the phrase, he who controls the technology controls the narrative. Look at John D. Rockefeller. He controlled the narrative over oil. Then along came Goodyear, who decided to control the narrative on rubber and rip up the railways of California and the West in order to be able to get rid of public transportation, because everybody needed his tires. So capitalism, yes, unrestrained capitalism. I also think we've seen an awful lot of the problems where it's more about me versus we, and a lot of the messes that we're in. But no matter what the technology is, there has been a bump. And how, is it, I punctuated it with you. You say tension. I kind of would like to approach it from the standpoint of Buckminster Fuller's word, tensegrity, where that there is a balance of tension and integrity in its given system. And how do you keep it from going chaotic? Well, that's what upper, lower bandwidth, bound, all that stuff that we've all written about for all the years comes in. And I think now with MetaWar, this is a potential tipping point because the cybersecurity industry has the experience, as you said, to do those parallels from what we've been through for 40 some years into when you look at cognitive security, an awful lot of it is the same. It's just we got to get this kind of done and the terminology and what do we mean and bring in the psychs and the neuros and bring in all these people to be able to make those metaphors actually actionable.
Well, and I think the last one to end on, I think is on everybody's mind right now, Ukraine. Ukraine and Russia are locked in a 2.5 year battle now. Completely, Samson and I'm sorry, not Samson, Goliath, bigger and smaller. The little dog is doing really, really well in this fight. And so much of it has to do with, I think, I would argue, transparency. And while any sane person doesn't, like military conflict, the reality is it drives a lot of evolutionary pressure. And we're seeing, I think, in front of us right now, transparency versus opaqueness. Because as you say, in Russia, Vladimir Putin controls the narrative, period. And, not a political statement saying that, everybody knows that, he would say it himself, I'm guessing, right? If you believe
I don't think that's an arguable position. I mean, that's like, yeah, that makes.
Yeah. So, say what you like about the Ukrainian administration or interest right now, but I think that you can take the content coming out of there with a smaller grain of salt, because again, it is a relatively open environment. There's international press on the ground. The information is relatively clear, right? And down to the specifics in the last couple of weeks, taking Russian territory. That you see the analysts talking about it. Why is Ukraine doing this? Because militarily and physically and strategically, may not make a difference. Yes, but in the information space, it makes a huge difference. It may, in fact, do more to change the situation than anything kinetic. And that's an evolutionary success of transparency.
And the it's not odd, but there's a certain degree of irony here, because if you go back to the concept of information warfare, even to the 60s, and we didn't have much of it, but the Russians looked at information warfare as a purely cognitive exercise. You can actually go back to the early KGB stuff under the Tsars, when the intelligence services, they did very similar things, and historically you can look at it the same way. But the U.S. had the opportunity back in the late 80s and early 90s to actually take that as an active position, because during détente, during the peace dividends of the early 90s and all that, we had a huge amount of opportunity to work with the Russian system. And I'm trying to get a little, not too specific about what I was involved in. And we stuck to our kinetic ways pretty much exclusively, especially in the public domain. So the EU is doing everything they're doing now in terms of cognitive defense at the national public. Oh, hell yeah, we're going to do this. And we're going to work from our toddlers up through upskilling adults and seniors as part of a cognitive immune system strengthening, cognitive defensive strengthening, whatever terminology you're comfortable with. So it's the same, just on, I hate that phrase, on steroids. Come up with a better phrase than that, would you, please?
Yeah, I'm afraid most of my phraseology is aging out and needs to be modified anyways, but that's what I get for surviving this long, right? Well, so we're right about a half an hour, which I think is about as much of the two of us, as the world should have to stand at any one time, and we can go on literally forever. But let me just last optimism check. I think the probability of the positive inevitability curve from here is extremely high, even in the nearish term. I think the U.S. will work itself out. It's not going to be the end of the country or the nation. We're not going to have World War III, and we'll find ourselves in 10 or 20 years with a system that we can feel pretty good about. Because to be clear, I don't want to have the government or the corporations or whatnot fact checking me because I have a fringe position. I want an honestly clear, competitive system. So
I want to cut the feedback loop, but that's another conversation.
It is. And we'll have those. All right. Thank you, Win. Thank you, everyone,
Thank you,
for your
Chris,
time.
as always.
We'll do more of this. Cheers, folks.
Cheers.